Welcome back to Untold Revenge Files. Today, the story you're about to hear takes place in Hadley Falls, Connecticut. My name is Claire Whitfield. I'm 34, and I'm the daughter who was never quite good enough. The one who worked 3 jobs to pay her own way through college, while her younger brother got everything handed to him on a silver platter. The one who lent her parents $40,000 they never paid back. The one who showed up every Christmas with a smile, a homemade pie, and hoped that maybe this year would be different. This is the story of the year it finally was. The snow had been falling since noon on Christmas Eve. Soft, fat flakes that caught the glow of the streetlights and turned the neighborhood into something out of a greeting card. The kind of snow that makes everything look peaceful, even when it isn't. I pulled into my parents' driveway at exactly 6 o'clock. The house was enormous, a restored colonial on 3 acres, white clapboard with black shutters, a wreath on every window. My father had bought it when I was 11, the year his insurance brokerage really took off. It was the kind of house that said, "We made it." Every Christmas, the whole family gathered here. 46 people, sometimes more. Aunts, uncles, cousins, second cousins, grandparents. The Whitfield family treated Christmas Eve dinner like an annual summit. Formal, photographed, and performed. I sat in my car for a moment, engine still running, the heater pushing warm air across my knees. In my lap sat a bourbon pecan pie. I'd spent 4 hours on it that morning. The crust was handmade, rolled out on a floured cutting board in my small kitchen. I'd used real vanilla extract, not the imitation kind. I'd toasted the pecans myself until the whole apartment smelled like brown sugar and warmth. It was my grandmother's recipe, my mother's mother, and I'd been making it since I was 16. I turned off the engine. The cold crept in immediately. December in Connecticut doesn't wait for you to get comfortable. I picked up the pie, tucked it against my chest, and walked up the stone path to the front door. Inside, I could hear voices, laughter, the clink of glasses, Bing Crosby playing faintly from the built-in speakers my father had installed last year. The door was unlocked, as it always was on Christmas Eve. I stepped into the foyer. The house smelled like roasted turkey, rosemary, and expensive candles, the kind my mother ordered from a boutique in New Haven. The hallway was lined with family portraits in gold frames. My brother's college graduation, my brother's startup launch party, my brother shaking hands with the governor at a charity event, my parents flanking him, beaming. There were no portraits of me. I hung my coat on the rack and carried the pie toward the dining room. The formal dining room, 22-foot ceilings, a chandelier that my mother had imported from an estate sale in Vermont. A long, polished mahogany table that could seat 24, extended with 2 additional folding tables draped in matching ivory linen. Gold candles flickered in crystal holders down the center. Place settings with real china, real silver, linen napkins folded into fans. 46 relatives were already seated or milling around, finding their places. My Aunt Sharon was adjusting her reading glasses, looking at the handwritten place cards. My Uncle Richard was already pouring himself a second glass of Merlot. Cousins I only saw once a year were hugging and catching up, their children darting between chairs. And at the head of the table, my parents. My father, David Whitfield, 61, silver-haired, wearing a navy blazer with brass buttons. My mother, Elaine, 59, in a cream cashmere sweater and pearl earrings. Between them, in the seat of honor, my younger brother, Garrett, 31, tailored sport coat, new watch, the easy smile of a man who had never once been told he wasn't enough. I walked toward my usual seat, 3rd chair on the left side near the middle, not close to my parents, not at the far end. The seat I'd occupied for 20 years. It wasn't there. In its place was a decorative plant, a tall, potted Norfolk pine wrapped in a red velvet bow. It sat exactly where my chair should have been, wedged between my cousin Laura and my Aunt Diane. I stopped. I looked at the plant. I looked at the table. I looked at the place cards on either side of it. There was no card with my name. The room didn't go quiet all at once. It happened in waves. First the people nearest to me, then the ones across the table, then the children at the far end, sensing that something had shifted in the air, the way children always do. My mother was the first to speak. She smiled. It was the kind of smile she used at charity events, polished, practiced, and completely hollow. "Claire," she said, folding her hands on the table, "we decided there's no seat for disappointments this year." The word landed like a stone dropped into still water. Disappointments. A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the room. Not everyone laughed, but enough of them did. My Aunt Sharon pressed her lips together and looked away. My cousin Marcus snorted into his wine glass. My Uncle Richard chuckled, then caught himself, then chuckled again. My father leaned back in his chair. He held his wine glass loosely, the way men do when they feel completely in control. "You're 34, Claire," he said. His voice was calm, almost gentle. That was the worst part. Still renting, still figuring it out. Maybe next year you'll earn a chair. More laughter, louder this time. My brother looked down at his plate, smiling faintly, as if this were mildly amusing but beneath him. 46 pairs of eyes settled on me. The room was warm. Too warm. The candles flickered in the draft from the hallway. Bing Crosby had moved on to White Christmas. The turkey smell was thick and heavy, almost cloying. Through the window behind my father, I could see the snow still falling. I stood perfectly still. I held the pie in both hands. I felt its warmth through the dish, the last trace of the morning I'd spent making it. Then, slowly, I stepped forward. I set the pie down on the table, gently, right in the center between two candle holders. Nobody spoke. I reached into my coat. I was still wearing it, I realized. I hadn't even made it to the coat rack inside the dining room, and I pulled out a sealed envelope. White, legal-sized, thick. I placed it beside my father's wine glass. He looked at it, then at me. I stepped back. "If I'm not worth a seat," I said quietly, "then you're not ready for what's inside that envelope." Silence. Total, absolute silence. I turned. I walked out of the dining room, through the hallway lined with portraits that didn't include me, past the coat rack, and out the front door. The cold hit me like a wall. My breath came out in clouds. The snow was falling harder now, covering my footprints almost as fast as I made them. I got in my car. I started the engine. I didn't cry. Silence was my strength. Have you ever been the family's quiet failure? The one they clap for politely at graduations and birthdays, but never actually believe in? The one they compare, always compare, to someone shinier, louder, more impressive? Have you ever been the scapegoat at your own table? If you have, then you already know what I'm about to tell you. And if you haven't, stay with me. Because this story isn't about a pie or a chair or a Christmas dinner. It's about what happens when the person everyone underestimates turns out to be the most powerful one in the room. Let me take you back. Growing up in the Whitfield house, the rules were simple. There was Garrett, and there was everyone else. Garrett was the golden child from the day he was born. 3 years younger than me, but somehow always ahead. He played lacrosse. He won trophies. He had coaches calling the house by the time he was 14. My parents paid for private training camps, travel tournaments, a personal tutor so his grades wouldn't suffer during the season. When it came time for college, they paid every dime. Full tuition at Dartmouth. No loans, no part-time jobs. They even leased him a car for campus so he wouldn't have to take the bus. When it was my turn, the conversation was different. "We think it builds character to pay your own way," my mother said. She was folding laundry when she told me. She didn't even look up. I went to a state school. I worked 2 jobs during the semester and 3 during the summer. I waitressed, tutored, and filed paperwork at a real estate office. I graduated with $62,000 in student loans and a degree in accounting. Nobody threw me a party. When I struggled in my first few years, when the entry-level jobs barely covered rent and loan payments, when I moved apartments twice because I couldn't afford the increases, my parents had a word for it: unstable. "Claire's always been unstable," my mother would tell relatives at gatherings. "Too sensitive, not practical. She doesn't have Garrett's drive." Garrett, meanwhile, launched a tech startup at 26. My parents co-invested. When it stumbled in its first year, they invested again. $60,000 total, poured into their golden boy's dream without a second thought. Nobody called Garrett unstable when his first product launch flopped. Nobody called him a disappointment when he burned through investor money redesigning his platform. They called him brave. They called him entrepreneurial. And then there was the loan. 5 years ago, my parents came to me. My father sat at their kitchen island, the one with the marble countertops, and cleared his throat 3 times before speaking. "We're in a temporary bind," he said. "Garrett's company needs a bridge loan, and we've already leveraged what we can. We need $40,000. $40,000. I'd been working for 7 years by then. I'd been saving carefully, painfully, dollar by dollar. I had exactly $43,000 in my savings account. It was everything I had. It's temporary, my mother added. We'll pay you back within 6 months. I gave it to them. 6 months passed. A year. 2 years. I never saw a penny. When I brought it up, gently, carefully, the way you do when you've been trained to believe that asking for what you're owed makes you difficult, my father waved his hand. You know we're good for it, Claire. Don't make this a thing. Don't make this a thing. $40,000 of my life, and I wasn't supposed to make it a thing. But here's what I want you to understand. I didn't want the money back. I mean, I did, of course I did. But what I really wanted was something much simpler. I wanted them to see me, to acknowledge what I'd done, to say, "Thank you, Claire. We see how hard you've worked. We see you." They never did. Instead, I became the family cautionary tale. The example parents whispered about when they wanted to motivate their children. Don't end up like Claire, still renting at 34, still figuring it out. At some point, I can't tell you exactly when, something inside me shifted. It wasn't a dramatic moment. There was no argument, no slammed door, no tearful confrontation. It was quieter than that. I simply stopped expecting them to change, and I started building. My real profession is forensic accounting. Specifically, I specialize in corporate fraud investigations. If you don't know what that means, let me explain it simply. When a company lies about its money, inflates its revenue, hides its debts, disguises personal spending as business expenses, someone has to find the truth in the numbers. That someone is me. I didn't stumble into this career, I chose it. Something about growing up in a family that constantly rewrote the narrative, that told me I was failing when I was surviving, made me fall in love with numbers. Because numbers don't lie. Numbers don't play favorites. Numbers don't remove your chair from the table and call it a lesson. After years of working at established firms, learning from the best forensic accountants in the Northeast, I quietly built my own practice. Whitfield Financial Forensics. I kept it small on purpose. No flashy website, no social media presence. Just referrals, results, and reputation. Within 3 years, I had a client list that would have made my father's jaw drop. I worked with federal investigators. I consulted on cases involving companies 10 times the size of anything my brother had ever touched. I testified in depositions. I was brought in when other accountants couldn't find the discrepancy, when the numbers seemed clean on the surface, but something underneath didn't add up. I was completely debt-free. I had paid off every cent of my student loans. I had rebuilt my savings. I had investments, retirement accounts, and a professional reputation that preceded me in courtrooms across 3 states. I never told my family any of this. Not because I was ashamed, not because I was hiding, because I had learned something that changed my life. Silence was my strength. When people underestimate you, they stop watching. They stop being careful. They say things in front of you they'd never say in front of someone they respected. They show you exactly who they are. And I watched. For years, I watched. Anger wasn't loud, it was controlled. Garrett's startup, Vantapoint Technologies, had been growing rapidly. At least, that's what the family was told. At Christmas Eve dinner, before my chair was removed, before the envelope, my Uncle Richard stood up and tapped his wine glass with a butter knife. "I'd like to make a toast," he said, cheeks already flushed from the Merlot. "To Garrett Whitfield, who might just take Vantapoint public next year." The table erupted. Applause. Whistles. My mother clasped her hands to her chest. My father nodded with the quiet satisfaction of a man who believed his investment, in every sense of the word, was finally paying off. Garrett stood. Humble wave. Practiced smile. "We're in talks," he said. "Nothing confirmed yet, but the numbers are strong." The numbers are strong. I heard it from across the room, and something cold moved through me. Not anger. Recognition. I'd heard that phrase before. In depositions, in boardrooms, from the mouths of CEOs who were 3 months away from having their assets frozen. It was the kind of language people used when the numbers weren't strong at all. Later that night, after the chair incident, after I'd left and driven home through the snow, my father called me. Not to apologize, not to explain. His voice had the same controlled calm he used when he was about to deliver instructions. "Claire," he said, I'm going to say something, and I want you to actually listen for once. I sat in my dark apartment. The radiator clicked and hissed. Outside, the snow had stopped and everything was still. "Maybe you should ask your brother for a job," he said. "He's doing well. He could use someone to handle the books. It might give you some stability." The public jab at dinner had been humiliating, but this quiet, private demolition of everything I was, felt worse. Because it was just us. No audience, no laughter, just my father, telling me in the plainest possible terms that he believed I was nothing. "Merry Christmas, Dad," I said. I hung up. I sat in the dark for a long time. Then I opened my laptop. 3 weeks before Christmas, I had received a case assignment through my firm's federal referral channel. It came in the way they always do. Anonymized at first, just a company identification number and a summary of irregularities flagged by the IRS. Mid-sized tech firm, Northeast region, flagged for irregular tax filings, possible inflated revenue, possible misclassification of investor funds. I opened the file. Company name, Vantapoint Technologies. I stared at the screen for a very long time. The radiator clicked. My coffee went cold. Outside, a dog barked somewhere in the distance. Let me be clear about what happened next, because this is important. I did not investigate my brother's company. I recognized the conflict of interest immediately, and I filed a formal recusal within 24 hours. I documented everything. I followed every protocol. I did exactly what the law and my professional ethics required me to do. But the investigation didn't stop because I stepped away. It continued. Another forensic accountant was assigned. The evidence was already there, sitting in Vantapoint's own records, like a bomb with a visible timer. And because I had seen the initial file, because I knew what was coming, I understood the scope of what my brother had done. The evidence was damning. Inflated revenue. Garrett had reported income that didn't exist. Sales that never happened. Contracts that were signed but never fulfilled. Booked as completed revenue to make the company look profitable. Misclassified investor funds. Money that investors put into the company for specific purposes. Product development, infrastructure, had been redirected. Some of it went to operating expenses that should have been covered by actual revenue. Some of it went places it absolutely should not have gone. Personal expenses billed as corporate deductions. Garrett had run personal purchases through the company. Dinners, travel, clothing, even a portion of his apartment lease, all classified as business expenses to reduce the company's tax burden. And the worst part, the part that made it inescapable, was that Garrett had digitally signed the amended tax filings himself. His name, his electronic signature, time-stamped and traceable. He hadn't even had the sense to have someone else file them. He'd done it himself, probably believing that no one would ever look. But someone always looks. That's what I do. That's what people like me are for. This wasn't revenge. It was accounting. The envelope I'd left on my father's table contained 3 things. First, a formal notice that Vantapoint Technologies was under federal investigation for financial fraud. Second, a draft freeze order indicating that the company's assets, and potentially the personal assets of its officers, could be frozen pending the investigation's outcome. Third, a loan liability breakdown showing that my parents, as co-signers on several of Garrett's business loans, were personally exposed to significant financial risk. If the company collapsed, and it was going to collapse, they would be on the hook. I didn't put those documents in the envelope to hurt them. I put them there because they deserved to know, and because they needed to stop laughing. I wasn't there when my father opened the envelope, but I heard about it. From 3 different cousins. From my Aunt Diane. From my grandmother, who called me 2 days later, crying. Here's what happened. After I left, the table was buzzing. People were confused. Some laughed it off. My mother rolled her eyes and said, "Always so dramatic." My father set the envelope aside and carved the turkey, but it sat there, white, legal-sized, thick, right beside his wine glass, catching the candlelight. Halfway through dinner, my Uncle Richard, who could never leave well enough alone, picked it up. "Well, aren't you going to open it?" he said. "Maybe she's finally sending you a resume." More laughter. My father sighed. He took the envelope. He slid his butter knife under the flap and opened it casually, the way you open junk mail. He pulled out the documents. He read the first page. His smile faded. Not quickly, slowly. Like a candle being starved of oxygen. The light didn't go out all at once. It dimmed, flickered, and then went dark. My mother leaned over his shoulder. I'm told her hand went to her mouth. Garrett, seated between them, must have seen their faces change because he stood up halfway. What? What is it? My father didn't answer. He was still reading. My Uncle Richard, who was seated close enough to see the header on the first page, read it out loud. He didn't mean to cause a scene. He was just the kind of man who read things out loud without thinking. Notice of federal investigation, he said. His voice carried across the table, across the crystal and the china and the carefully folded napkins, across the faces of 46 relatives who had been laughing 5 minutes ago. Silence. Not the awkward silence of a bad joke. The heavy silence of a room that has just realized the ground beneath it is not solid. Someone, my cousin Laura, I think, whispered, "Is this real?" Nobody answered her. Garrett snatched the documents from my father's hands. He read them standing up, his face cycling through confusion, denial, and finally something that looked a lot like fear. The color drained from his cheeks. His new watch caught the candlelight as his hands trembled. The room was so quiet, I'm told you could hear the snow settling on the windowsills outside. The candles flickered. The turkey sat cooling in the center of the table, untouched. Bing Crosby had stopped playing. Someone had turned off the speakers, or maybe the playlist had simply ended, leaving nothing but the sound of 46 people breathing. My father looked up at the empty space where my chair should have been. The decorative plant sat there, its red velvet bow now looking absurd, almost grotesque. He called me. I answered on the second ring. "Claire?" His voice was different now. The controlled calm was gone. In its place was something I had never heard from my father before. Uncertainty. "What is this?" "It's exactly what it says it is," I said. I was sitting in my apartment. The radiator clicked softly. A cup of tea steamed on the table beside me. Vantapoint was flagged for financial irregularities. I was initially assigned to the case. He started. I recused myself, I said, immediately, because of the conflict of interest. I followed every rule, but the investigation continued without me. It was going to happen regardless, Dad. The numbers don't lie. I heard Garrett's voice in the background, sharp and rising. "She did this. She reported us. This is her getting back at—" "Garrett." My voice was calm, steady. I wasn't angry. Anger wasn't loud. It was controlled. I didn't report anything. The IRS flagged the filings independently. I was assigned the file by coincidence. I removed myself, but the evidence was already there. "What evidence?" my father asked. "Inflated revenue, misclassified investor funds, personal expenses run through the company." And Garrett signed the amended filings himself, digitally, time-stamped. Silence on the other end. Then my father's voice, smaller now. "What happens now?" "The company's assets will likely be frozen while the investigation proceeds. If fraud is confirmed, and Dad, the evidence is very clear, there could be charges, criminal charges. And because you and Mom co-signed several of Garrett's business loans, you're personally liable for those debts if the company can't cover them." I heard my mother's voice in the background, high and thin. "David, what does she mean? What does she mean, personally liable?" "It means," I said, "that the money you invested, the loans you co-signed, all of it is at risk." More silence. "Claire," my father said, and for the first time in my life, I heard something in his voice that sounded almost like respect. Or maybe it was just fear wearing a similar mask. "Can you fix this?" I looked at the steam rising from my tea. I looked at the snow outside my window. I thought about the pie sitting on their table, the one I'd spent 4 hours making from my grandmother's recipe. I thought about the chair that wasn't there, the plant with the velvet bow, the laughter. "I'm not your accountant, Dad," I said quietly. "I'm not Garrett's bookkeeper. I'm a forensic investigator who was too much of a disappointment to earn a seat at dinner." I let those words sit. "You should hire a lawyer," I said. "A good one. Merry Christmas." I hung up. I set my phone face down on the table. I took a sip of my tea. This wasn't revenge. It was accounting. The weeks that followed were swift and merciless. Not because of anything I did, but because numbers have their own momentum, and fraud, once exposed, unravels fast. Vantapoint's accounts were frozen in the first week of January. Every dollar locked. Garrett couldn't make payroll. His employees, 37 people who had believed in him, who had taken lower salaries for equity that was now worthless, were suddenly stranded. Investors pulled out, not gradually, all at once like birds lifting off a wire at the sound of a gunshot. The news traveled fast in Connecticut's small tech investment community. By mid-January, Vantapoint's name was toxic. Garrett hired a lawyer, then fired that lawyer and hired another. The second lawyer was more expensive but more honest. He told Garrett the truth. The digital signatures, the timestamps, the paper trail, it was all inescapable. In March, Garrett settled the civil charges. He agreed to financial penalties, repayment plans, and a permanent bar from serving as an officer or director of any publicly traded company. The settlement kept him out of prison, but just barely. The investigation had found enough for criminal prosecution. The settlement was a mercy he didn't deserve, but was smart enough to accept. My parents were hit next. The loans they'd co-signed came due immediately when Vantapoint defaulted. $220,000 in personal liability. They refinanced their house, the beautiful colonial with the black shutters and the wreaths on every window. They took out a second mortgage. They sold my mother's car. They canceled a European vacation they'd been planning for 2 years. The extended family went quiet. No more toasts at dinner. No more bragging about Garrett's empire. No more jokes about Claire's rented apartment. Nobody called me unstable anymore. Nobody called me a disappointment. But nobody called me at all. And that was fine. I want to be very clear about something. I did not gloat. I did not celebrate. I did not post on social media or call relatives to say I told you so. That's not who I am. That's not what this was about. This wasn't revenge. It was accounting. In the spring, I channeled everything I was feeling, and I was feeling a great deal, even if I didn't show it, into something constructive. I started a nonprofit. I called it Foundation First. Its mission was simple: financial literacy workshops for young entrepreneurs, ethical business practices, how to build something real, something honest, something that doesn't collapse when someone finally looks at the numbers. I taught the workshops myself, at first. Standing in community center meeting rooms with a whiteboard and a box of markers, explaining to 23-year-olds with big dreams and small budgets how to read a balance sheet, how to classify expenses correctly, how to file taxes without cutting corners, how to build wealth slowly, honestly, one brick at a time. I bought my own home that summer, a small Cape Cod on a quiet street in Hadley Falls. 2 bedrooms, a garden, a front porch with a swing. I painted the walls myself. I hung my own pictures. Not portraits of achievement, just photos of places I'd been, people I loved, moments that mattered. The following Christmas, I hosted my own dinner. It was small, 8 people. My college roommate, Sarah, 2 colleagues from my firm, a neighbor who had no family nearby, my grandmother who had called me in January crying, and who had called me every week since, not to apologize for the family, but just to say she loved me. I cooked the turkey myself. I used real candles. I set the table with plates I'd bought at a local pottery shop. Not fine china, just beautiful, handmade things that felt warm in your hands. And I set an extra chair at the table. It sat at the end, empty, with a place setting and a napkin folded neatly beside the plate. Sarah noticed it. "Who's that for?" she asked. "No one specific," I said. "It's just there, so no one ever has to wonder if there's room for them." We ate. We laughed. We told stories. The house smelled like roasted turkey and rosemary and the pine wreath I'd hung on the front door. Outside, the snow was falling again, soft and quiet, catching the light from the windows. It was the best Christmas I'd ever had. Not because of what I'd gained, because of what I'd let go. The chair wasn't for approval. It wasn't for my parents or my brother or anyone who had ever made me feel small. It was for peace. I want to leave you with this. The loudest people at the table aren't always the strongest. Sometimes they're just the most afraid. Afraid of silence. Afraid of being seen for what they really are. They fill the room with noise so no one notices the cracks. Sometimes the one without a seat, the one standing at the edge of the room, holding a pie no one asked for, wearing a coat no one offered to take, owns the foundation the table stands on. Never confuse silence with weakness. Silence is what happens when a person has stopped needing your approval and started trusting their own. This wasn't revenge, it was accounting, and the numbers never lie. If this story moved you, If you've ever been the one without a seat at the table, I hope you know that your silence is not emptiness. It's power. It's patience. It's the quiet before everything changes. If you connected with Claire's story, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Stories of Quiet Strength so you never miss a story. Leave a comment below. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And remember, your chair is waiting. You just might need to build your own table.